So good morning from Future Leaders of the World. This is Anita Craig here this morning with Colin Adam, one of the founders of EnneaInternational. Welcome, Colin, onto this call.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Great to be with you here this morning. And just to let the audience know, this is a series of interviews that Future Leaders of the World are conducting with our key partners. These are people and organizations that we have worked with over a number of years and journeyed with. And here on the call this morning with Colin in particular, we've walked a journey which began with its roots in the Enneagram and has moved into different contexts, along with it personal friendship, running, and more particularly, their work, EnneaInternational, that they are dedicated to putting out in the world a service that is for the betterment of individuals, teams, and organizations. And Colin, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you moved to South Africa, I think I understand you brought with you the Enneagram as one of the first introducers, teachers, facilitators, developers of the Enneagram into South Africa. Is that right?
Well, not quite. I didn't have the Enneagram when I first came to South Africa. It's quite a long time ago now, that. But not too long after. This would have been probably mid-1990s. I can't remember the actual year. That's when I came across the Enneagram. My studies were in psychology and related areas. And I'd never come across this model before in my studies or anything. And it just so happened that actually a visiting professor from the United States, one of the universities there, North Florida University, came across, and he was offering some open public lectures in the evenings at UCT, University of Cape Town. And this thing called the Enneagram was featured. And I'd never heard of this thing before. So I thought it might be interesting to go along and see what it was about, which I did. And eventually one thing led to another. I became great friends with him. That was Bob Suginski, Professor Bob Suginski. And he became a real mentor and friend and teacher, to me. So I actually learned the Enneagram initially from him. That was in I would say early to mid 1990s. And at that point in time, the Enneagram was fairly unknown, I think, in South Africa. It certainly wasn't in the corporate space. It wasn't, I'd never heard of it, even though I'd worked in the corporate space with large organizations, prior to that. And I'm pretty sure that, and I could be, if anybody sees it differently, correct me on this, I think we were the first to introduce the Enneagram into corporate leadership development and team development with one of the large organizations here. That was actually Shell, the Shell organization. And we started to work with it at that point and built an assessment, a pure Enneagram assessment at that point, which is an online assessment. So I think we were probably the first to take the Enneagram into I would say, leadership and team development space, certainly in the corporate environment at that point. So yeah, that's how it worked.
Thank you. The richness of storytelling and going back to some of the origins and how things come into being is fascinating. Sure. And so here we sit today, decades later, with your endurance, your persistence, your continued dedication to honoring, I guess, what feels to be your calling in life and following that purpose and keeping your radar true to that. And now today we look at this beautiful suite of global offerings that EnneaInternational have put together. And on another call that I had with your co-founding partner, Jaime Gordon, he's explained quite a few of those products to us. And what I'm loving is how you are managing to integrate these two seemingly, they can be seen as disparate worlds, the one of the more etheric, you could call it, highly personal journey that something like the Enneagram can represent to a person and their personal development, but how you're also bringing it into the corporate and the mainstream space with the backings of science and technology, and bringing it into a language that is accessible, practical, useful for people in any stream of work, but particularly I'm understanding Ennea's market really has been in the organizational realm of leaders and teams.
Mm.
And today's call, given the context of where we're at in lockdown in South Africa, COVID, we'd like to explore here with you today how this work and this opportunity in this time of being at home, often people on their own or with very little interaction with others now, can use this time to self-discover, to self-explore. And then what is the significance of this work? How is it actually going to help people to know about it, to access it, to work with it? What are the great gifts that you and your organization bring and offer to the world at a time like this? So looking forward to the discussion with you, Colin.
Sure. And there's a lot in what you've just said, of course. I guess the way, I look at things, and you're quite right, the bulk of our work as a business is with the corporate space. And it's either working directly with leaders and teams. In fact, that's an interesting concept in itself. Just to put the sort of alternative to one side for a moment, but very typically in leadership development, the traditional way is to often take a leader out of their environment that they're leading in and to give them some kind of experience, a learning experience, often a really powerful one. And I've been involved in that myself. And then they go back into their leadership environment. And it's almost like we parachute them back in and sort of wave bye-bye and hope for the best. And typically what I've noticed, and this is what drew me actually into coaching, what I've noticed is that if you go back to those leaders 2 or 3 months later after the learning intervention, very often it's almost like nothing happened. There was no learning intervention. It's almost like they've gone back into their old ways, their original way of being is what I would call it. So you see there's not a lot of behavioral change. That's not true for everybody, but often it is the case. And so part of our thinking is around systems. So systems thinking really kind of underpins an awful lot of what we do. So if you understand systems theory, it suggests that a system likes to preserve itself. It doesn't like to change. It's almost like it's got a will of its own to retain the status quo. And if you try to change the system, it tends to push back. So if you take an individual out of that system, which the immediate system is that leader's team, you kind of help them to adapt and change and give lots of wonderful input, put them back into the system. With all the good intention in the world, they will try to change things, but the system will tend to push back and preserve itself. So, and there's a point where one kind of gives up in a way. One just goes back into the old ways of doing things, the old habits. So our sense is that we need to work with the system, not just with a component part of it, which is a fairly Newtonian kind of idea. Take that little cog out of the machine, do something with it, refurbish it, put it back in again, and then everything will be fine. I think in the human context, often that doesn't work. And one needs to kind of understand the system, how it's operating right now. In our language, we would often call it the current narrative, the current story, the current way of being of that system. And to understand where that system needs to go. How does it need to change to be more effective? How does a leader need to be to help that system adapt into the future that is manifesting? How does the team as a whole need to adjust? And to kind of work with that system. Of course, that's sort of a micro system. A team is usually part of an organization, part of a culture, et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of what we try to do. So we work primarily not just with leaders or with individuals, but with the system that they tend to be in. So a lot of our work is with teams, and two sides of that coin, in a sense, will be the leader and the team. And how do they integrate? How do they fit together? Right down to individual team members. What's the team culture like? What's the language like? What's the way of being of that system? And what works really well and what doesn't seem to work so well? And how can we support that system to move in an appropriate direction and build the capacity to adapt into the future that they're designing for themselves? So that's kind of the thinking there. Just going back to one of your points, I suppose, this idea of the corporate world versus another world, whatever that might be, the personal world, the family world, the social environment. In principle, I don't think we see a difference, really. The context is different, but it's still a human being that you're working with.
Yes.
Whatever the context that human being is in. We don't drop our human beingness at the door of the corporate environments that we walk into. We carry some of that with us. We may try to adapt to the context, and of course we do, but the essence of the human being is still there. And I think that's what we're trying to do. It's not, it's about adapting into the future, being able to adapt, to build a capacity to work in multiple contexts that we find ourselves in. And our world is changing so rapidly at the moment. It's hard to know what's going to happen tomorrow. It's really difficult. So how do you prepare for that? How do you prepare for the unknown? How do you prepare for the unexpected? This current COVID-19 crisis, who would have thought 3 months ago that the whole world would have been in lockdown? It was hard to predict. And that's becoming more and more relevant to our modern day life. The 21st century is very different from the 20th century and the centuries before. And one of those major differences, it seems to me, is the ever increasing rate of change. And I know that's a cliche. In a way, I think it's a concept as opposed to a reality, but we're living the reality now. It's kind of with us. So how do we prepare for that? And I think a lot of our work is about that. The corporates use language like agility. How do we build agile organizations, agile teams, agile leaders that can adapt into new circumstances and still be effective? What are those capacities and skills and qualities that are needed there to do that? And those qualities and capabilities are going to be required not just in the corporate world. It's going to be required in your family. It's going to be required in your social environment. It's going to be required anywhere that human beings show up, basically. So I don't particularly make a distinction between, the corporate setting, human beings in the corporate setting, as opposed to human beings elsewhere. In fact, just out of interest, now you're probably not aware of this, we're starting, almost as we speak, to design a process and a program for families using the essence of the 5 lens model that we have, and the Enneagram, which is a backbone to that whole thing, and adapting what we've got and taking it into families. And you can equate families to a team, I think. This is where I think children learn how to cooperate, how to relate to other people. They come across leadership for the first time. They come across conflict for the first time. And these are going to be the future leaders of our communities, of our corporations, of our businesses, of education, et cetera, et cetera. So what are they learning in this family environment that's going to equip them for that? And the challenge is, can we assist them with that? Is it something that we could input there? Families are under pressure. Lots of broken families, lots of broken relationships. And that seems to be endemic, across the world. So there's a sense that maybe we can take some of this work and add some value, in that sort of process as well. So, I think our work is with human beings. I would rather suggest that our work is with human beings rather than with corporations. That's where I would position us, actually.
Hearing you, and thank you. Great to understand the versatility and applicability of your work as I'm hearing it now, being able to reach into any context of the individual or system in which the individual functions and operates in the context of their lives, and therefore the applicability and adaptability of the work, the product, and the service that you've designed and are delivering. And just loving watching the journey with Ennea as it evolves and grows and extends and reaches into now your offering, as you say, into families around the world. Much needed work. So Colin, what I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about is when you look at what you're doing, how do you take what it is that you're offering and looking through the world through these 5 lenses or the lens of the Enneagram? Maybe you can just briefly run through them and name them, and then how is this actually applicable and relevant to the current condition, and how can people access this work for themselves now? What would be your tips, your advice, any gems that you have seen yourself in your own life, perhaps during this time, and of others around you, possibly some of your clients, that is useful for people to know about, that they can actually empower themselves?
Yeah, so I guess it's where to start there. What's the kind of way in? So if one goes back to Peter Senger's work, Senge speaks of personal mastery in his original book that he produced, and it kind of links to moving forward. It links to where am I right now? What's my current reality? Where am I sitting right now? And where do I need to go? What's the picture that I'm trying to move towards? What's the objective? What's the vision that I'm trying to reach? And first of all, do I have that? Do I have a vision? And if I do, and I'm starting to move towards it, the concept that Senge came up with was that we get excited. We get excited about a vision when we create it. And there's a lot of positive energy around it. And we start to take a few steps moving towards it. And it feels often relatively easy to take those first few steps. But as we continue to move towards that, we start to face challenges. We're moving on to new territory. We've never trod on that ground before. If we had, it would be in our current reality. It isn't. This vision is in the future. And so we're moving towards it. And inevitably, we're going to come across things that we haven't come across before. Challenges, adversity, positive things as well, enablers, disablers, all of the rest of it. We're going to have to face ourselves, face our fears, learn new things, unlearn things from the past that don't serve us anymore. It's quite a journey. And, many people, I think, kind of give up on that journey, or they compromise. By compromise, I almost mean bring the vision closer, change the vision and make it just easier to access. But it's not my original vision. And so, when I reach it, it feels, I've kind of got somewhere, but it's not quite what I wanted. Or some people give up completely. They just get resigned to it and just go back into their original lives again, their current reality, carry on, as they normally do. But it feels like not more than a compromise, perhaps, in that situation. So how do we build a capacity to move forward into the unknown to some extent? And bringing it back to our current circumstances, things are changing so rapidly. The COVID-19 thing, the social isolation, the fact that we are restricted in terms of where we can go and when we can go and what we can do, when we can do it. all of that is kind of new that people were not expecting. So how do we adapt? How do we adapt into that? So, one of the concepts is understanding self. And when we spoke yesterday, actually, I kind of used the analogy of this ship, this vessel that's on the ocean, and stormy weather happens. And it can be really tumultuous. It can be really kind of heavy weather that we're trying to navigate through. And how do we do that? How does a ship do that? How does a vessel get through that? Well, first of all, it needs to have a compass. It needs to have a sense of direction where it's trying to get to. And I think that's true for us as well as human beings. And I would relate it to the why question. Why am I doing what I'm doing? What's my purpose? What's the meaning for me? Do I have a purpose and meaning in my life? When we look at our version of personal mastery, it's encompassed in there. We have two elements really that talk to it. One is referred to as directed passion. Do I have a sense of what I'm trying to move towards? And does it feel like the right path for me? Does it motivate me? Does it inspire me to move forward? And the other element that I would draw on there would be something called global connection, which is feeling connected to something bigger than me. So it's not just an objective, but it's something, it is about purpose. It's about meaning. It's about deeper sense of meaning. What am I about as a human being? Why am I doing what I'm doing? For me, that is a sense of compass. That gives me a sense of purpose, a sense of direction before anything else happens. If we don't have that when the stormy weather hits, we are lost. I think it's hard to find a direction. We get kind of lost at sea. We're just kind of treading water if we're not careful, just trying to stay alive, basically. So meaning and purpose is a big part of it. I think that's embedded in what we do without getting too technical around the actual model itself, but those things are present there. We also, I think, need to understand ourselves. What are our strengths? What are those strengths that I need to access to get through the adversity? What are the enablers that I can draw on for internally, my own resources that I can access to get to where I want to be and to achieve what I want to achieve? So self-awareness is a big part of it. Where am I strong? Where am I not strong? Where are the learning opportunities? What used to serve me in terms of my behavior, but doesn't serve me anymore in this new environment? So there's a sense of needing to maybe unlearn certain things and learn new things, which is where the neuroscience starts to come in, the opening of new neural pathways and perhaps the diminishing of others, the closing down of others. So this idea of adapting. So I think in our personal mastery model, those kind of elements are there. We have something called self-acceptance, which is about understanding self and being able to live with the things that are not so great about me without getting too negative and down and self-critical, but just knowing that they're there and deciding, do I need to do something about those things, and actually working on what I need to work. So the idea of understanding self is very present, to have a sense of direction, to have an acceptance of reality rather than denying it. So this is a new reality that we're in at the moment, this kind of lockdown scenario. There's not a lot that I can do to change that. It's not my decision to unlock, that environment. I've got to kind of accept that, but within it, how do I operate? So there can be a sense of diminishing in that. One can end up in a sense of, it's almost like a scarcity mindset, feeling boxed, feeling closeted, feeling pushed into a smaller space, a smaller environment. And it's very easy from that position to begin the negative self-talk, how terrible it is, how awful it is, and to actually start verbalizing that to other people. And if you think about the outcome of that, the only outcome that that's going to generate is a sense of, I feel bad because that's my narrative. And I'm probably going to make other people feel bad as well because I'm kind of dumping this negativity on others, and it's not going to be helpful. So can I accept the things that I can't change? I'm reminded of the serenity prayer there. but focus on the opportunities, see the opportunities, look for the opportunities in this. So what are the learning opportunities? How can we adapt into this? How can we see the spaciousness in our new environment as opposed to this scarcity, this closed inness?
Yes.
So yeah, we've
And
given something up.
Changes just by how one changes the orientation in the
Yeah,
seeing and thinking differently, the energy immediately changes, doesn't it?
exactly. And the narrative changes. So we get trapped in our narrative, I think, our internal self-talk, which is linked to the Enneagram, of course, in many ways. But our internal chatter, that happens, which is repetitive very often and habitual. If we change the narrative, if we change the way we see things, change the narrative, new things can open up, new possibilities open up, new opportunities. So I think that's a big part of what we do with individuals and with teams and with organizations, is to start enabling them to look at the same situation a little differently, to change a perspective. When one changes perspective, perhaps there's different language that emerges, different opportunities, different possibilities, and so on. So that's a big part of what we do. So personal mastery for me is about understanding self, essentially, and being able to access my resources, noticing where I'm less strong and where I need to grow and develop further, to build new capacities, and to be intentional about that, and to have meaning and purpose around what I'm doing, to have a compass, in a sense. So I think personal mastery has a huge part to play. The second area is emotional resilience, which has a strong relationship to levels of stress and the internal experience that we have when things are not going the way we would like them to go.
Wow, and what a time to discuss that, because how real is it for people at the moment? I was describing to a close friend the other day, just in terms of the sense of fatigue, like we're at the end of an ultra marathon of sorts in this lockdown, and we've come into the stadium, and then someone says, no, you've got to go out and run another 5Ks, you haven't finished the race yet. And so this thing of fatigue, and how do we push through? How do we find another inner strength and resource during this time, that we don't then collapse in a heap before the finish line?
Absolutely.
So that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's a huge thing. I think personal mastery, which is our first lens of the 5, and emotional resilience, which is the second, kind of go together hand in glove, quite honestly. So emotional resilience is really the in a way, the inverse of stress, or the converse to it. So it's kind of, what is my level of resilience to face adversity? So when adversity is in front of me, what's my response to it? Am I able to find a way through it? Do my stress levels increase to such an extent that it incapacitates me? And whatever skills and capacities that I actually have, somehow I can't access those resources, and there's a sense of stuckness. And there's an emotionality to stress as well. There's a thinking process that goes on. There's a physical process. Our body chemistry changes, which is fine in the short term. But if we are in a high stress situation for an extended period of time, things like adrenaline, we're exposed to an awful lot. Cortisol, we're exposed to an awful lot. Hormone changes in the system, and lots of other changes, which can erode our immune systems. And that relates directly to where we are right now. The COVID-19 pandemic requires us, if we're going to get through this, to have strong immune systems. It's one of our natural defenses against not just viruses, but bacteria and other threats in the environment to health. So it's a huge component at the moment. And how do we build a capacity to be able to handle stressful situations more effectively? So again, that's one of the major components in our approach to the 5 lens, which has a direct link to the Enneagram. The Enneagram describes patterns of behavior, as you know, And within our habitual pattern, our Enneagram style, we can either show up incredibly well at our best version of self, or at our very worst, or somewhere in between. Stress can take us to our bad place, our worst self sometimes, and it affects our behavior. So behavior is affected by levels of stress. There's no question about that. So can we understand that? Do we recognize when we're stressed? And how do we build the capacity to deal with it? How do we build coping mechanisms to deal with the triggers of stress, as it moves forward? So that's a huge component, and it's very relevant right now. Not just with the COVID-19 coronavirus, but just in the 21st century world that we live in. Yeah. There is so much change going on, so much adapting that we have to do, and learning and unlearning that we have to do if we're going to thrive. And that can impact our levels of stress and our immune system. So it relates to health, levels of health ultimately, as well. Yeah. So those are two components that fit in there, just as an example. So I think what we've put together is, one can say it's quite a in a way, it has complexity. There are 5 ways of looking at human beings here, and each of those ways has its own complexity. But human beings are complex. So I think any model or lens or approach that tries to or attempts to understand a human being, by necessity has to explain the complexity in human behavior. We're not simple beings. We are very complex, and hence we tried to. It's almost like 5 photographs of an individual from different angles that we try to take through these different lenses to get data for the individual, so that they can see themselves as holistically as possible and start to make some choices around that. So I don't know if that kind of touches on the question that you asked, but maybe that's where I would at least start, to answer it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's as you noted in the beginning of this call, it's a big, broad, and complex subject, and not easy to simplify it always. But it certainly helps, and I've seen it firsthand how it's helped me, given me a map for this territory to navigate, as you say. But more than that, it offers this pathway. It helps to show the way to walk and the directionality, as you say. And I think that that's useful, and is also differentiated between the work that you've put out in the world and a lot of other flattered-ended assessment reports that may offer you something, some information, but then it stops and starts there. So I like to think of the work that you do as a journey, and it helps to provide the map, and the resources and the support and the tool also help to navigate that territory, which is so important, and in a very real way, because it's not binding, it's not fixing, it's not limiting the individual. It's doing the exact opposite. It's opening up these doorways of insight and moments to reflect and dig deeper and do that self-exploration.
Yeah.
And what time better than now, that if we need to self-discover, here's the time. We have the time, the space, and the conditions. We've been forced into it, but we can willingly choose to participate in a way that is going to bring out, hopefully, the best outcome for each person. And that choice lies in each individual's hands. What are they actually going to make and do and think, and how they're going to use this time? And that word that you used earlier, the word of opportunity, this is real time for opportunity in these adverse conditions. And history just shows us these great figures who've walked before us, the grandfathers and the grandmothers of history, how actually in times of adversity, that's when people have this opportunity to dig in the deepest and find this well of gold and potential inside themselves.
Mm.
So thank you for opening up that dialogue for us
Yeah,
here.
yeah. No, I think that's what leadership is about. It's not about standing still, running on the spot, doing the things that we've always done. Leadership is about moving forward, treading on new territory, being courageous enough to move away or out of our familiar zone into something new. It's what the old explorers did, navigating around the world. I think leadership is really about that. It's having the courage to step out, away from the familiar into the unfamiliar, and building the capacity to do that, and the ability to do it. And I think what we're trying to do here is to, amongst other things, help people find navigational tools that they can access to help them do that, to move forward. But it begins with understanding self, I think, understanding what your own resources, your current story, your current strengths that you can access and maybe utilize more of, in a sense, but also understanding what are the new things I've got to learn, and being okay with falling down, tripping up, making mistakes, getting it wrong, getting up again and learning from the experience so that we get stronger and we carry on. We don't allow it to stop us. We carry on and hopefully work with others, not just independently. So I'm just reminded of Stephen Covey's old concept of interdependence. We do, especially in times of adversity, we need to work together. And that's a little bit more challenging when we're isolated, in a lockdown scenario, but it's not impossible. And we need to find ways to do it. So those are some of the thoughts that I have. And we haven't spoken about the Enneagram at all. I don't know if you wanted to go into that space or just keep it more general. But I think you got a flavor of what we're trying to do, what we're aiming to do with our work, and to equip people to help leaders as well. So we do work with groups and teams and leaders, but we also, I think, as you know, put these tools into other people's hands, into facilitators' hands, into coaches' hands, so that they can also utilize this work in what they do.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you for your time. And who knows, maybe we'll take some time another day and delve into some of the other subjects close to your and my heart.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and go well.
You too. Thanks so much. Thanks, Anita.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.